The night did not announce itself as important. There was no storm, no thunder tearing the sky apart, no omen that warned the plantation what was about to happen. It was simply cold. The kind of cold that crept through thin wooden walls and settled into the bones, refusing to leave. In a small cabin pushed far from the main house, an enslaved woman lay on a narrow cot, soaked in sweat despite the winter air, her breathing uneven, her hands gripping the edges of the mattress as if holding on to the last solid thing left in her world. The candle beside her flickered, throwing long, distorted shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to move on their own, stretching and shrinking with every flame's breath. She had been in labor for hours, too many hours. The other enslaved women who had been allowed inside whispered to one another in hushed tones, their faces tight with fear. Something wasn't right. This pain was different. It came in waves that didn't fade properly, each one stronger than the last, leaving her no time to recover before the next crashed into her body. Outside, the plantation slept. No bells rang, no footsteps hurried to help. Enslaved women were expected to endure pain quietly. Suffering was part of their duty. When the first cry finally pierced the air, it was thin but unmistakably alive. Relief rippled through the room. A baby meant survival, another worker for the future, another body counted in the plantation's ledgers. But the relief did not last. Minutes passed, and the woman's body did not rest. Instead, it tightened again, violently, as if refusing to stop. Panic crept into the midwife's eyes. This was not how it was supposed to go. The second baby arrived in a rush of blood and breathless fear, smaller, quieter, its cry barely rose above a whimper before fading into weak gasps. The women exchanged glances, dread settling heavy in their chests. 2 babies were rare enough, but the pain still did not end. The mother screamed now, no longer able to contain it, her voice tearing through the night like a wound splitting open. When the third child emerged, the room fell silent. No one spoke, no one moved. 3 babies lay wrapped in rough cloth on the floor beside the cot, their tiny chests fluttering unevenly. Triplets. None of the women present had ever seen such a thing. Not in stories, not in whispers passed between cabins, not even in rumors carried from other plantations. This was something unnatural here, something dangerous. One of the women crossed herself instinctively. Another backed away as if afraid the sight itself might curse her. The midwife swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she checked each child. 2 were frighteningly small, their skin almost translucent in the candlelight. The third, though still fragile, had more color, more movement, more life in its cry. It kicked weakly, as if already fighting for space in a world that did not want it. The mother barely saw them. Exhaustion dragged her consciousness in and out, her eyes struggling to focus. When she finally turned her head and realized there were 3 bundles instead of 1, confusion washed over her face, followed quickly by fear. She knew what this meant before anyone said a word. On this plantation, nothing extra was allowed to exist. One of the women slipped quietly out the door. No one had to ask where she was going. News like this could not be hidden. By morning, the mistress would know, the overseer would know, and when they knew, decisions would be made that no enslaved woman had the power to stop. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin walls, carrying the sound of the baby's cries across the fields, a sound so small, yet so heavy with consequence. The plantation dog stirred. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted in its stall. Life moved on, unaware that inside that cabin, fate had already changed. By dawn, the cold had deepened. The candle had burned low, wax pooling at its base like something melted and ruined. The mother lay still, her arm weakly stretched toward the babies, as if trying to pull them closer, as if proximity alone could protect them. The other women had done what they could, cleaned, wrapped, whispered prayers under their breath, but none of them slept. Fear kept their eyes open. Fear and the certainty that the worst part of the night had not yet arrived. As the first grey light crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, footsteps approached. Heavy, deliberate, not hurried, not concerned, the kind of footsteps that belong to people who never expected to be told no. The door opened without knocking, letting in a rush of cold air and authority. The overseer stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes already scanning the room. Behind him, the mistress followed, her posture stiff, her expression tight with irritation rather than surprise. She looked at the mother briefly, then at the babies. Nothing about her face softened. 3. She counted them silently, 3 mouths to feed, 3 fragile bodies unlikely to survive without constant care, 3 future problems. Her gaze lingered on the smallest 2, then settled on the 3rd, the one still moving, still crying. Something calculating passed through her eyes. The cabin, once filled with whispers and breath and pain, fell into a suffocating silence. Even the babies seemed to sense it, their cries weakening, fading into uncertain sounds. The enslaved women stood frozen, eyes lowered, bodies tense, knowing better than to speak. This was no longer a birth. It was a problem. And on this plantation, problems were never solved with mercy. The mistress did not step fully into the sea. Abin, at first. She stood near the doorway, as if unwilling to let the cold wood and iron smell of blood cling to her clothes. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, but her expression never changed. This was not shock, it was assessment. She had seen death before. She had seen women break, children fail to survive, bodies carried out before sunrise. What lay on the floor that morning did not disturb her emotionally. It disturbed her economically. The overseer moved first. He crouched near the bundles, untied the rough cloth with practiced hands, and exposed the infants to the air. The cold made the smallest one shudder violently. Its skin looked stretched thin over fragile bones, its breathing shallow and uneven. The second was not much better. Its chest rose and fell too fast, as if each breath might be its last. The third baby cried louder, angrily, its tiny fists clenching and unclenching, as though already resisting the world that had received it so cruelly. The mistress leaned forward then. She did not touch them. She never did. Touch was for property that required maintenance, not inspection. Her eyes moved between the children slowly, deliberately, as though weighing stones in her mind. 3 births meant 3 risks, extra food, extra care, extra time taken from laboring women who were already stretched thin. Worse still, weak babies often became sick children, and sick children became wasted effort. The plantation did not tolerate inefficiency. How long? Scared, her voice flat. The midwife hesitated before answering. "Since late last night, ma'am." The mistress clicked her tongue softly, an expression of annoyance rather than concern. A long labor meant a weakened mother. A weakened mother meant less work. Everything reduced itself to numbers in her mind. Output, loss, gain. She gestured toward the smallest infant. "That one won't last." It was not a question. It was a conclusion. The overseer nodded slightly. He had learned long ago that agreeing quickly was safer than offering opinion. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the baby's chest, watching the faint rise and fall. "Breathing's weak," he said. "Would take a lot to keep it alive." "And the other?" the mistress asked, already knowing the answer. "Not strong either." Her gaze returned to the 3rd child, the light one. It kicked again, its cry echoing faintly off the cabin walls. There was strength there, not much, but enough. Enough to be useful, enough to justify survival. The mother watched all of this from the cot, her eyes wide now, fully awake despite her exhaustion. She understood what was happening, even if no one spoke directly to her. She had lived long enough on this land to recognize the signs, the tone, the distance, the way people talked about living things as if they were already gone. Her arm tightened around the edge of the mattress. She wanted to speak, to beg, to scream, but she knew the rules. Enslaved women who begged were punished. Enslaved women who screamed were silenced. The mistress straightened, smoothing her gloves. "We cannot keep all 3. The words landed heavily in the room, sinking into the wood, into the air, into every listening body. One of the women gasped softly before catching herself. The overseer did not react at all. "They will drain resources," the mistress continued, as if explaining a simple inconvenience. "And they will likely die anyway. Keeping them all is foolish." Her eyes flicked briefly to the mother, then away again. Not once did she use the word children or babies. She spoke only in outcomes. "What do you suggest?" the overseer asked, though he already understood. The mistress paused. "Not for moral consideration, but for calculation. We keep the strongest, the one with a chance. The others—" She let the sentence trail off. It didn't need to be finished. Silence stretched again, thick and suffocating. The babies whimpered softly, unaware that their lives were being measured and divided. The mother's breathing grew shallow. Her hands trembled uncontrollably now, her body reacting before her mind could fully accept what was being decided. One of the enslaved women fell to her knees suddenly, pleading before she could stop herself. "Ma'am, please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're just born. Maybe if—" The overseer turned sharply. "Enough." The mistress did not even look at the woman. "Remove her," she said calmly. The overseer grabbed the woman by the arm and pulled her up, dragging her out of the cabin despite her quiet sobs. The door slammed shut behind them. The sound echoed louder than any scream. The message was clear. Mercy was not welcome here. The mistress stepped closer to the babies, pointing. "This one," she said, indicating the light one. "He stays." She paused, then added, "The others will not." There was no ceremony to the decision, no record written, no announcement made. This was how things disappeared on plantations, not with violence visible to the world, but with quiet, efficient choices made behind closed doors. The overseer reached for the two weaker infants, lifting them carefully, almost gently, not out of compassion but habit. Fragile things still needed to be carried properly. The mother let out a sound then, not a scream but something broken, raw, torn from deep inside her chest. She tried to sit up, her body screaming in protest, her arms stretching toward the babies as if sheer will could pull them back. "No," she whispered. "Please." The mistress turned sharply. Her patience was thin now. "You will be quiet," she said, "if you want the one to live." Those words struck harder than any whip. The implication was unmistakable. Resistance would cost her the last child, too. The mother collapsed back onto the cot, tears spilling freely now, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to form words that refused to come. Her chest heaved with silent sobs. She bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood. Fork. Ing herself into stillness. The overseer hesitated only briefly before moving toward the door with the two infants cradled against his chest. The door opened. Cold air rushed in, then it closed again. Just like that, two lives were removed from the room. The mistress lingered a moment longer, watching the remaining baby cry in the cold. "Feed him enough to keep him alive," she instructed, "but don't waste milk. He'll need strength soon." Soon meant work, soon meant ownership, soon meant a future measured in labor, not love. She turned and left without another glance. The cabin felt emptier now, not because the babies were gone, but because something unseen had been taken with them. The enslaved women stood motionless, unsure whether to comfort the mother or stay distant for their own safety. Finally, one stepped forward and placed the remaining baby gently against the mother's chest. The child's crying softened as it felt warmth, breath, heartbeat. The mother wrapped her arms around him instinctively, holding him too tightly, as if afraid he might be taken too. Her tears soaked into his cloth, her body shaking with grief she was forbidden to express aloud. Outside, the plantation resumed its rhythm. Bells rang. Orders were shouted. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But inside that small cabin, a line had been crossed, one that could never be undone. This was not just a decision about survival, it was a calculation that would haunt every breath. That followed. They did not give her time. That was the cruelest part. There was no space to think, no moment to process what had just been decided on her behalf. The overseer had barely stepped outside with the two babies before the mistress's words settled into the cabin like poison in the air. "If you want the one to live." Those words echoed louder than any scream, looping again and again inside the mother's mind, twisting tighter each time. She lay there staring at the rough wooden ceiling, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. Her body had just been torn open to bring life into the world, and now it was being torn open again in a way no wound could show. Her arms felt empty, even though one child still lay against her chest. empty because only moments ago there had been three. Her arms remembered the weight of all of them. Her skin still felt the ghost of the two that were gone. No one asked her permission, no one waited for her answer. But somehow, impossibly, the burden of the decision still fell on her. The plantation would never say it outright, but the truth was clear. If she resisted, if she made noise, if she begged too loudly or tried to fight, the remaining child would disappear just as easily as the others. Survival had been placed in her hands in the most twisted way imaginable. One of the enslaved women approached quietly, her eyes filled with fear and pity. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then stopped. There were no words that could exist in a moment like this. Instead, she reached down and gently adjusted the cloth around the baby, making sure his tiny face was free to breathe. The simple gesture broke something inside the mother. She turned her face into the thin pillow and let out a sound she had been holding back, a low, shaking moan that carried more pain than any scream. Her shoulders convulsed as tears soaked into the fabric. She wanted to claw at the floor, to chase after the overseer, to demand her children back even if it meant death. But fear held her down. Fear and the fragile warmth of the one child still alive against her skin. In her mind, everything fractured. She saw flashes of what should have been. 3 children growing together, 3 small hands gripping her fingers, 3 voices calling her name. The visions came uninvited and left her gasping. She forced herself to stop imagining. Imagination was dangerous. Hope was deadly here. The door creaked open briefly as the overseer returned alone. His face was unreadable, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He nodded once at the women in the room, a silent signal that it was over. Whatever had been done was finished. No questions were allowed. The mother did not look at him. She couldn't. If she did, she knew something inside her would shatter beyond repair. She focused instead on the small rise and fall of the baby's chest. Each breath became something to count, something to cling to. As long as he was breathing, she had not lost everything. The lie she told herself to survive the moment. The women slowly drifted out of the cabin one by one, leaving her alone. They were not cruel for leaving. They were afraid. Fear ruled every movement on the plantation. To linger too long was to invite punishment, suspicion, questions they could not afford to answer. When the door finally closed, the silence was unbearable. It was in that silence that the reality of what had happened fully settled into her bones. This was not just loss, it was participation. Even though she had been powerless, even though the choice had been forced upon her, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. 2 of her children were gone because she had stayed still, because she had been quiet, because she had wanted one to live. Her mind rebelled against the thought, but it would not leave her. It circled endlessly, cruel and unforgiving. If I had screamed, if I had fought, if I had run. Each possibility ended the same way, with all 3 dead. That was the truth she had been given, and it was a truth designed to break her. She held the surviving baby closer, her fingers trembling as she traced the tiny curve of his back. He was warm, alive. He let out a weak cry, then settled, soothed by the sound of her heartbeat. That sound had once belonged to 3, now it belonged to 1. Her tears fell silently onto his cloth. She did not wipe them away. There was no reason to hide them anymore. No one was watching, no one cared. Time lost. Its shape in that cabin. Minutes stretched into hours. The pain in her body faded into something distant, replaced by a deeper ache that had no physical location. She drifted in and out of sleep, waking each time in panic, instinctively checking that the baby was still there. Each time she felt his breath, a wave of relief washed over her, followed immediately by guilt so sharp it made her nauseous. Why him? Why this one and not the others? The questions had no answers, but they tormented her relentlessly. She studied his face in the dim light, searching for something that explained his survival. He looked no different than the others had, small, fragile, innocent. And yet, the world had decided he was worth keeping. As the day wore on, the sounds of the plantation filtered back in, the distant crack of a whip shouted orders, the rhythm of forced labor resuming as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The normalcy was obscene. Life moved forward without pause, indifferent to the devastation contained within that one small room. By evening, the mistress returned briefly. She stood in the doorway again, surveying the scene with detached satisfaction. One child, one outcome. The problem had been resolved. "You'll be expected back in the fields once you've healed," she said, her tone brisk. "Until then you feed him, keep him alive." Then she left. No acknowledgement of what had been taken, no recognition of the cost. The mother did not respond. She stared at the empty spa. CE near the door long after it closed, her expression hollow. Something inside her had gone quiet, not numb, something deeper. A part of her that had once believed love could exist freely, even here, had been extinguished. That night, as darkness wrapped around the cabin once more, she whispered to the baby for the first time. Not words of joy, not promises of a bright future. She whispered names, softly, desperately, the names of the two children who would never hear their own cries again. She whispered them again and again, as if speaking them aloud might anchor their existence somewhere in the world, as if memory alone could keep them from being completely erased. The baby stirred, unaware, his tiny hand curling around her finger. She closed her eyes, letting the contact ground her. This child was alive because two others were not. That truth would follow her forever. On that plantation, people would later say she had been given a choice, but in her heart, she knew the truth. It was never a choice at all. The child grew, but not in the way children were meant to grow. His survival was watched too closely, measured too often, questioned in whispers that followed him wherever he went. From the moment he could lift his head, his existence carried a weight heavier than his small body should have known how to bear. He was the one who stayed, the one who remained when two were taken. Even before he could understand words, the plantation had already given him an unspoken entity, the spared one. The mother learned quickly that survival did not mean safety. She fed him carefully, rationing her own strength to keep him breathing, knowing that any sign of weakness in him would invite the same cold calculation that had taken the others. When he cried too long, fear shot through her chest like a blade. When he slept too quietly, she shook him gently, panic flooding her veins until his tiny chest rose again. Every breath he took felt borrowed, temporary, as if the plantation might come to reclaim it at any moment. She was allowed to nurse him, but only because it served a purpose. Milk was cheaper than loss. Love, however, was a liability. She learned to hide it. She held him close only when no one was watching. She whispered to him only in the deep hours of night, when the darkness felt thick enough to swallow sound. In daylight, her face became a mask of obedience. She could not afford to let anyone see how much he meant to her. As he grew stronger, the whispers grew louder. Some of the enslaved people believed the child was marked, not blessed, marked. They said no child could live after such a beginning without carrying something unnatural inside him. They noticed how his eyes seemed too aware, how he rarely cried without reason, how he stared into corners of the cabin, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. When he laughed, it was soft and brief, never lingering, as though joy itself felt unfamiliar to him. Others said the mother had done something forbidden to save him, that she had traded souls, that she had begged the wrong spirits. Superstition thrived where truth was buried, and on that plantation, truth had been buried deep. The mother heard the rumors but never responded. She kept her gaze low and her mouth shut, just as she always had. But at night, when the child slept against her chest, she felt the weight of those words press down on her. She wondered, in her quietest moments, if they were right, not because she believed in curses, but because guilt had a way of shaping itself into something monstrous. She could never look at him without seeing the others, as his body filled out and his steps grew steadier. Memories she tried to bury resurfaced with cruel clarity. She remembered the exact shape of the smallest baby's mouth, the way the second had twitched in her arms, fighting weakly against the cold. Those memories did not fade with time. They sharpened, and every milestone the surviving child reached, his first steps, his first word, cut her open anew. She celebrated nothing. When he was old enough to understand language, she began to notice the questions forming behind his eyes. He watched other children with siblings closely, tracking their movements, their bonds, the way they leaned into one another naturally. Sometimes He asked questions she could not answer. "Why don't I have a brother?" he asked once, his voice small and curious. Her hands stilled. The air left her lungs. "B. 'Cause the world is cruel," she said finally, though he was too young to understand what that meant. He accepted the answer without protest, but the question did not leave him. It returned in different forms over the years, circling the truth like something afraid to land. Each time, she deflected. Each time, the distance between them grew just a little more, not because she loved him less, but because loving him hurt too much. The plantation wasted no time in claiming him. By the age of 6, he was already being trained to work. Small tasks at first, errands meant to teach obedience. He was praised for his strength, for his endurance, for the way he did not complain. The overseer took particular interest in him, watching him with the same evaluating eyes the mistress had used the day he was born. "He's a good one," the overseer said once, "strong, quiet." The mother stood nearby, her jaw clenched. Those words had been spoken before. They had been the reason he was still alive. As the boy grew, strange things seemed to follow him. Accidents happened around him more often than chance could explain. Tools broke in his hands, animals reacted oddly to his presence, horses skittish, dogs whimpering or refusing to come near. When other children fell ill, he remained untouched. When fever swept through the cabins, he survived while others did not. The whispers returned louder now. Some said the spirits of the lost babies walked beside him, guarding him. Others said they followed him in anger, waiting to reclaim what had been taken. No one said these things openly, but the looks they gave him told him enough. He learned early that he was different, even if he did not know why. The mother noticed the way people watched him. She noticed how they stepped back slightly when he passed, how conversations stopped when he entered a room. Fear clung to him like a shadow, and she hated herself for knowing the reason. At night she still whispered the names of the lost children, though her voice had grown hoarse from years of doing so. Sometimes the boy stirred when she spoke them, his brow furrowing as if the sound unsettled him. Once, half asleep, he whispered back, "Who are they?" Her breath caught painfully in her throat. "Just names," she said quickly. "Old names." But he never forgot them. As he entered adolescence, the weight she carried became visible in his posture, in the way he held himself slightly apart from others. He worked harder than anyone his age, driven by something he could not name. Survival felt like an obligation, not a gift. He did not waste it on rebellion or complaint. He endured, and endurance on that plantation was the most valuable trait of all. The mother watched him from a distance now. They spoke less, not because affection was gone, but because the truth stood between them like an unbridgeable gap. She saw in his face questions he was afraid to ask, and she feared the day he would finally demand answers she could not survive giving. She wondered often whether saving him had truly been an act of mercy. Some nights, when the plantation was quiet and the past felt too close to breathe around, she imagined the 2 children she lost standing at the edge of the cabin, watching, not accusing, just waiting. In those moments, she could not tell whether the boy sleeping nearby was a blessing or a reminder of everything that had been taken from her. The plantation would remember him as the one who lived, but for her he would always be the child who lived in the shadow of the dead. Years passed, but the plantation never truly moved on from that night in 1839. It pretended to. The ledgers were updated, the fields kept producing, and new names replaced old ones as people were bought, sold, or buried without markers. Officially, only 1 child had been born that winter. Only 1 had survived. The other 2 never existed on paper, and on a plantation what wasn't written might as well have never drawn breath at all. But memory does not obey records. Among the enslaved, the story lived on in fragments, half-spoken sentences, looks exchanged in silence, warnings whispered after dark. No one told it the same way twice, but the core never changed. A woman. 3 babies, 2 taken before the sun had fully risen. The details shifted with each retelling, but the unease remained sharp, like a splinter that could not be pulled free. The plantation itself seemed to remember. Workers spoke of a heaviness that settled over the land after that winter, a feeling that clung to the air even on warm days. Crops failed more often than before. Animals sickened without reason, accidents multiplied, falls from ladders, tools slipping at the wrong moment, fires that started and stopped without explanation. The overseer blamed carelessness, the mistress blamed incompetence, but the enslaved whispered another explanation when no one was listening. They said something had been unbalanced. The boy grew into a man under this shadow, though he never knew its full shape. By the time he was grown, his name was spoken with a mixture of respect and unease. He worked harder than most, endured more without complaint, and seemed to escape dangers that claimed others. When illness swept through the cabins, he survived. When punishment was handed out, it often passed him by, as if fate, self hesitated around him. Some said he was protected, others said he was cursed to outlive everyone else. He felt it too, though he lacked the words for it. A constant pressure, a sense that his life was not entirely his own, that something unseen walked beside him, close enough to feel but impossible to touch. He woke often from dreams he could not explain, dreams of crying in the dark, of cold hands slipping away, of voices calling his name in tones that were neither angry nor kind. He never spoke of these dreams. The mother aged faster than she should have. Grief carved lines into her face long before time had earned them. She worked, she endured, she obeyed, but something in her eyes had dimmed permanently. Those who looked closely could see it, a vacancy where hope had once lived. She was still alive, still breathing, but a part of her had remained frozen in that cabin, on that morning, watching two of her children disappear. She never told her son the truth, not fully, she could not. The story lived in her body instead, in the way she flinched at sudden footsteps, in the way she went quiet whenever winter returned, in the way her hands shook when she counted anything higher than one. She feared that speaking the truth aloud would make it real in a way she could not survive. And yet the truth had a way of surfacing on its own. One evening, years later, an old man who had worked the plantation since before the boy's birth spoke too freely after drink, loosened his ocean. He mentioned the winter of the triplets casually, as if it were common knowledge. The room went silent. Eyes shifted. Someone changed the subject too quickly. But the seed had been planted, the man asked his mother that night, his voice low, controlled. He did not accuse, he simply asked. She looked at him for a long time before answering. Too long. There are things you don't need to carry, she finally said. His jaw tightened. I already carry them, he replied, though he could not yet name what them meant. She said nothing more. She never did. When she died there was no ceremony, no marker, just another body lowered into the earth, another name fading from memory. But on the night she was buried, the man sat alone outside the cabin where he had been born, staring into the dark. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what had been taken from him. Not just siblings, but a life that might have been different, lighter, whole. The plantation did not survive forever. Like many others, it declined, fractured by debt, disease, and the slow erosion of a system built on cruelty. Ownership changed, buildings rotted, fields returned to wild growth. Eventually, people moved away, leaving the land to remember itself. Long after the cabins collapsed and the main house stood empty, locals still avoided the area. They spoke of strange sounds at night, of cold air that lingered even in summer, of an overwhelming sense of sorrow that settled on anyone who stayed too long. Children were warned not to wander there. Animals refused to graze near the old foundations. No one talked about records anymore. No one needed them. The story endured because it was never really about numbers or survival or even death. It was about what happens when choice is weaponized, when a mother is forced to measure love against obedience, when life is allowed to exist only if it serves power. 2 babies were erased in 1839, but the erasure did not end with them. It spread outward, touching everyone who lived on that land afterward. The mother carried it until her final breath. The child carried it into adulthood, into every step he took, every night he lay awake listening to silence. History would never record their names, but the silence they left behind was loud enough to echo for generations.